The rain had no mercy that night. It fell in cold, heavy sheets across the cobblestones of Mayfair, soaking through silk, through velvet, through every fine thing a lady was supposed to protect herself with at a royal gathering. But Lady Amelia Hawthorne was no longer thinking about her dress. She was not thinking about propriety, or the gasps she would earn for running through the streets of London without a chaperone, or the mud ruining her sapphire slippers. She was thinking about the two words she had overheard 20 minutes ago, pressed against a cold marble column in Lord Ashworth's grand ballroom, barely breathing. The girl knows too much. That was all it took. 22 years of quiet survival. 22 years of smiling when she wanted to scream, of accepting every pitying glance society threw her way, of being the forgotten daughter of a ruined nobleman. And then one single evening of curiosity, and suddenly her life was worth less than the paper she had found folded inside her father's old leather journal. She ran. Down the servants' corridor, through the kitchen courtyard, past the stables where the horses startled and snorted into the wet dark. She did not look back. She had learned long ago that looking back only made the fear heavier. The street ahead was black and slick, lined with rows of private carriages waiting for their owners to finish dancing and drinking inside the warmth of Lord Ashworth's estate. Most were occupied, coachmen hunched under oilcloths, lanterns swaying. But near the far end of the lane, half hidden beneath the shadow of a great elm tree, sat one carriage with no lantern lit, no coachman visible, its curtains drawn completely shut, abandoned. Or so she believed. Amelia did not stop to consider her options. She yanked the carriage door open, climbed inside, pulled it shut behind her, and collapsed against the leather seat, pressing herself into the corner, shaking. The inside smelled of cedar and something darker, expensive tobacco perhaps, or the kind of cologne that only men of serious power wore. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she would rest for only a moment, catch her breath, and slip away once she was sure she had lost the men from the ball. She did not plan to fall asleep, but exhaustion has no respect for plans. She woke to movement. The carriage was rolling. The city sounds outside had changed no longer the wet clatter of Mayfair cobblestones, but the quieter, smoother rhythm of a road leaving London. And across from her, settled into the opposite seat with the stillness of a man entirely used to commanding rooms without opening his mouth, sat someone she recognized immediately. Even in the dimness there was no mistaking him. Tall, dark-haired, with waves that fell slightly over a sharp forehead. A jaw that looked as though it had been carved from something unyielding. Eyes so dark, they seemed to absorb the little light that entered through the curtained window. He wore black, a perfectly fitted aristocratic coat with silver buttons, an immaculate white cravat at his throat. He held a single leather-bound document in one hand, and he was watching her. Not with surprise, not with alarm, with the calm, measured patience of a man who had already decided what he thought, and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Duke Sebastian Blackwood, the most feared nobleman in England. Amelia's mouth opened. No sound came out. "You have been asleep for nearly 3 hours," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the kind of weight that made people instinctively straighten their posture. "I considered waking you in the first hour. You looked, however, as though you genuinely needed the rest." A pause. "And I was curious." "Curious," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. About what manner a young woman climbs uninvited into a duke's private carriage and immediately falls into the sleep of the completely unbothered. Amelia pressed further into the corner, her mind racing through every possible outcome of this moment. None of them were good. The Duke of Blackwood did not help people. He did not extend charity. He was known for exactly two things: his power and his willingness to use it without hesitation against anyone who inconvenienced him. She had just inconvenienced him. "I apologize," she said, reaching for the door handle. "I will leave immediately. I will not trouble you further. I will—" "The carriage is moving at considerable speed," he said, without changing his expression. "And the road beyond that door is dark and wet. You are welcome to jump, naturally. However, I would advise against it." She stopped. He tilted his head very slightly. "Sit down, Lady Hawthorne." The sound of her name on his lips froze her entirely. Not because it was said with threat, it was not. It was said with the casualness of a man who had known it before she walked through his door. "You know who I am," she said slowly. "I knew who you were," he replied. "The moment you climbed in." He turned a page of the document in his hand with the air of a man returning to an interrupted task. "I also know why you ran." The carriage rolled on through the dark, and Amelia Hawthorne sat back down not because she felt safe, but because something in the way he said those words told her that running from this man would be the second greatest mistake of her evening. The first had already been made, and somehow, sitting across from the most dangerous duke in England, she was not entirely sure it was a mistake at all. To understand how Amelia Hawthorne ended up in a stolen carriage in the dark, you must first understand what she had been running from long before that rainy night. She had been running from being forgotten. The Hawthorne family had once been respected. Not wealthy in the way the great dukes were wealthy, not the kind of wealth that built marble staircases and kept a household of 40 servants, but comfortable, dignified, with a solid name and a modest estate in Wiltshire that had been in the family for 3 generations. Her father, Lord Edmund Hawthorne, had been a kind man, a quiet man. The sort who read too much, laughed at the wrong moments during formal dinners, and loved his daughter with the uncomplicated wholeness that some fathers managed and many did not. He died 2 years ago. Officially. Bankruptcy. A series of disastrous investments. Debts that had apparently accumulated over years without his family's knowledge. The estate had been sold. The servants had been let go. The Hawthorne name, once a respectable entry in society's ledger, had been crossed out quietly and neatly, the way people erase something they would prefer not to remember. Amelia had not believed it then. She did not believe it now. Her father had not been reckless. He had not gambled. He had not speculated wildly on foreign ventures, the way so many noblemen chose to ruin themselves. He had been careful, sometimes frustratingly, methodically careful about every coin that left the family accounts. The collapse made no sense, and no one had offered her a satisfying explanation. The solicitors had spoken in circles. The men who had once called themselves her father's friends had stopped returning correspondence entirely. So Amelia had done what she always did when the world refused to give her answers. She had gone looking for them herself. For the past 2 years, she had lived in a rented room above a dressmaker's shop on the less fashionable end of Piccadilly, surviving on a small allowance from a distant aunt who had enough Christian duty to send money every quarter, but not quite enough to send warmth. Alongside it, Amelia had used those 2 years carefully. She had accepted every invitation that still came her way. They were fewer now, because fallen nobility is only interesting to society for so long before it becomes an inconvenience, and at each gathering she listened, she had watched, she had catalogued names and relationships, and the careful silences between powerful men who did not say what they meant in public. And 3 weeks ago she found something. Hidden inside the false bottom of her father's old travel trunk, the one thing she had managed to keep when everything else was seized, she had discovered a journal. Not a diary in the ordinary sense. More records, pages of careful, neat handwriting tracking meetings, transactions, and names. Names she recognized. Names that appeared regularly in the court circular and on the invitation lists of the finest houses in London. Names of men who had publicly mourned Lord Edmund Hawthorne's ruin, while privately, it appeared, orchestrating it. She had stared at those pages for a long time. Then she had made a decision that was either very brave or very foolish. She had not yet determined which. She had gone to Lord Ashworth's masquerade ball to find more evidence, to listen more closely, to put the remaining pieces into order before deciding what to do with what she knew. She had not planned to be overheard doing it. Now, sitting across from the Duke of Blackwood in the moving darkness, she pressed the journal against her body, beneath the folds of her cloak, and tried to decide how much of this to share with a man she did not trust. The answer, she decided, was none of it. "Where are we going?" she asked instead. "My estate in Surrey," he said. "Blackwood Hall. It is approximately 2 hours from here. I did not agree to travel to Surrey." "No," he said agreeably. "You agreed to nothing. You simply climbed into my carriage uninvited, fell asleep, and are now in the early stages of trying to decide whether I am more dangerous than the men you were running from tonight." She met his gaze. He was not unkind in the way she had expected. He was not cruel. He was simply precise, as though every word he used had been carefully selected, and she was expected to be sharp enough to receive it. "And which are you?" she asked. He considered her for a long moment. "Neither," he said at last, "or perhaps both, depending on whose side you find yourself on. But not yours, Lady Hawthorne, not your enemy." He set the document down on the seat beside him. "You found your father's records." It was not a question. Amelia's blood went cold. "What do you know about my father's records?" "More than you at the moment," he said, "though perhaps not for much longer, if the evening at Ashworth's is any indication." He glanced out the curtained window briefly. "You were in the east corridor. You heard Thornfield speaking to Haverley. And you left before they saw your face." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Because," he said, with the kind of patience that suggested he had been waiting for this conversation. "For quite some time, I was in this west corridor, and I was listening to the same conversation." The carriage rolled on. The rain drummed against the roof, and the silence between them filled itself, slowly, with a great many unanswered questions that neither of them was yet ready to voice. Amelia looked at the Duke across the darkened space between them. His face gave nothing away, but something had shifted in the room. Some invisible scale had tipped, just slightly, toward possibility. She tightened her grip on the journal beneath her cloak and waited. Blackwood Hall was everything that Amelia had imagined it would be, and yet nothing like what she had felt prepared to see. It rose from the Surrey countryside in the grey-blue light. Before dawn, a great, dark stone manor surrounded by iron gates and old oak trees that had long since grown tall enough to hide the sky. It was not showy. There were no excessive towers, no gilded gates. It was simply large and solid and ancient, and it looked the way the Duke himself looked, as though it had existed long before the current rules were written and intended to outlast whatever came next. A small staff received them at the door without visible surprise, which told Amelia that the Duke of Blackwood arrived at unusual hours with some regularity. She was given a room warm, quietly elegant, smelling of fresh linen and wood smoke, and was told breakfast would be available at whatever hour she chose to come downstairs. No one asked her any questions. No one appeared alarmed by her presence. It was the most disorienting hospitality she had ever received. She did not sleep again. Instead, she sat at the small writing desk by the window and spread her father's journal open, going through every page again with the careful attention of a woman who knew that her next move needed to be her best one. What she found that she had been piecing together slowly over weeks now began to take a sharper shape. The night of Lord Ashworth's masquerade, Amelia had dressed carefully. Not to be seen, rather the opposite. She had chosen a deep blue gown that was fine enough to pass without remark, but not distinctive enough to be remembered. She had worn her hair up in the style expected at such events, with a simple mask of dark velvet over her eyes, and she had moved through the glittering rooms of Ashworth Manor the way she always moved through society now. Quietly, on the edges, watching. She had arrived looking for one thing specifically, a man named Lord Reginald Thornfield. He appeared in her father's journal more than any other name. Not always directly, sometimes it was an initial, sometimes a role described rather than named. But Amelia had traced the threads carefully enough to be certain. Lord Thornfield, silver-haired and silver-tongued, the picture of dignified aristocratic authority, had been at the center of something her father had discovered and written down. And her father had died shortly after. She had found Thornfield near the card room, speaking to a cluster of younger men who laughed at his stories, with the slightly too eager laughter of people in the presence of power. She had watched him for nearly an hour, patient as a woman who had learned that patience was the only currency available to those without money or title, and then he had excused himself and walked toward the east corridor. She had followed. The corridor was quiet, lit by a single gas lamp at the far end. Thornfield had stopped midway where a second man was already waiting, narrow-faced, grey-eyed, a man she knew by sight as Lord Haverley, one of the most influential members of Parliament's private committees. "It cannot wait much longer," Haverley had said, his voice barely carrying. "The solicitors are getting nervous. If she finds the secondary account documents before we have had the chance to." "She won't," Thornfield had said, with the confidence of a man accustomed to being right. "She's a girl without money, without allies, and without any idea of what she is actually sitting on. She poses no real threat." "She was Hawthorne's daughter," Haverley had replied. "He didn't tell us everything. What if he told her?" A pause, then quietly. "The girl knows too much." Amelia had pressed herself flat against the wall, not breathing. "Then we handle it," Thornfield had said. "The same way we handled everything else, quietly, and before anyone notices." She had run. She told the Duke all of this over breakfast the next morning, not because she had decided to trust him, she had not, but because she had thought about it through the small hours of the night, and concluded that she was in a position where withholding information was a luxury she could no longer afford. She was in his house. He already knew too much, and the alternative to some degree of honesty was sitting in silence while powerful men planned what to do with her. Sebastian listened without interrupting. He sat very still, which she was beginning to recognize as his natural state, the stillness of a man who had learned that most people reveal far more when given room to speak than when pressed. When she finished, he set down his coffee cup and said, "Secondary account documents." That's what Haverley said. "Your father had more than the journal." It was not quite a question. She answered it anyway. "I don't know. I found the journal 3 weeks ago. I've been through everything else he left. There was nothing else hidden, nothing I found." She paused. "But he was careful. He would have put something somewhere I wouldn't think to look, or somewhere he believed was already safe," Sebastian said. She looked at him across the breakfast table. Morning light came through the long windows of his dining room and fell across his face in a way that made him look, for a brief moment, less like a man to be afraid of, and more like a man who was already tired. "You've been investigating this," she said. "You said you were listening to the same conversation. You know more than you've told me." "Yes," he said. "Then tell me." He looked at her for a long moment. Something behind those dark eyes turned over, shifted. Not quite a decision, but the beginning of one. "Your father," he said quietly, "was not ruined by bad investments. He was murdered, Lady Hawthorne, and I have been trying to prove it for nearly 2 years." The dining room was very quiet. She had known. Some part of her had always known, and yet to hear it spoken aloud clearly, by someone who was not doing her, the patronizing kindness of protection made the whole room tilt slightly. She did not cry. She had done that in private, in the dark, in her small room above the dressmaker's shop on Piccadilly. She simply nodded once and said, "Tell me everything." He did not tell her everything at once. That was the first thing she understood about Sebastian Blackwood. He was not secretive out of cruelty or the desire to maintain power over others. He was secretive the way a man becomes secretive, when he has learned, at cost, that sharing too much too early only gives enemies the chance to move. He told her what she needed, in the order she needed it, with the precision of someone who had arranged this information many times in his own mind and was now choosing his opening carefully. It had begun, he said, not with her father but with Sebastian's own. The late Duke of Blackwood had been a member of a particular parliamentary committee, one concerned with the management of estates, inheritances, and title transfers among the nobility. It was not a glamorous committee. It dealt in paperwork and procedure, in the technical machinery of aristocratic wealth. But power, as Amelia's father had apparently also discovered, is often concentrated in exactly the places that appear most boring. Over a period of years, several members of that committee named Sebastian Thornfield. He was named Haverley. He named a third man, Lord Aldous Pemberton, who sat on 3 separate boards, and whose name appeared in exactly none of the public records one would expect had built something, not through violence at first, through paperwork, through the quiet falsification of estate assessments, through the manipulation of inheritance, laws so fine-grained and technical that ordinary solicitors, presented with the documents, would see nothing wrong. They had been stealing estates, not dramatically, not all at once. One family at a time over more than a decade, using legitimate-looking bankruptcy proceedings and manufactured debt records to acquire properties at a fraction of their true worth. Properties that were then absorbed into a private land trust, registered under a shell title. The profits from which funded their political influence, their positions, their social standing. The Hawthorne estate had been one of several. "My father discovered it," Sebastian said. He began documenting what he found, intending to bring it before the Crown. He died before he could. He said it flatly. No performance of grief. The official record calls it a heart complaint. He was 54 and had never had a day's illness in his life. Amelia sat very still. "And yours?" he said. "Your father worked alongside mine at several points." They corresponded. "I believe your father discovered not only the full extent of the scheme, but something they had not expected him to find: the true legal ownership structure. The proof that the properties were never legitimately acquired. The documentation that would unravel everything. The secondary account documents," she said. Yes. She thought about her father's journal. The careful lists of names, the dates, the coded references she had spent weeks deciphering. "He knew," she said softly, more to herself than to Sebastian. "He knew, and he was building a record. He was protecting us." The last word came out thinner than she intended. "He was protecting you," Sebastian said. "The record he built was designed to be found by the right person at the right time. I believe the secondary documents, whatever they are, were placed somewhere he considered safe. Somewhere connected to you specifically." She frowned. "Connected to me?" Why? Because, Sebastian said, with the first trace of something that was not entirely analytical in his voice, the documents don't only prove their crimes. According to what I've been able to piece together, they also prove that you are the legal heir to the full Hawthorne estate, which was never legitimately bankrupted, and that the estate's value, including what was taken from it, is substantial enough to be a significant problem for some very important people. Amelia stood up from the table. She walked to the window. She looked out at the grey Surrey morning, the old trees, the iron gates, the ordered gravel drive that led away from this strange house into a world that had just become considerably more dangerous. They were not just trying to silence her because she had overheard something at a party. They were trying to silence her because she was the one person who, if she found the right documents, could take everything from them. "How long have you known this?" she asked without turning around. "I've suspected most of it for 18 months, Sebastian said. "Known with certainty, perhaps 6 weeks. You knew who I was before I got into your carriage." "Yes, you were at that ball looking for me." A pause, carefully weighted. "I was watching Thornfield, and yes, I had intended to find a way to speak with you before the evening ended. You somewhat accelerated that plan." She turned from the window. He was watching her with that same dark, measuring calm. She searched his face for signs of manipulation, of the sophisticated social theater that powerful men were so skilled at performing. She did not find it, or at least, if it was there, it was too well disguised for her to locate. What she found instead was something that looked, perhaps, like respect. "If I help you find what my father left," she said, "you intend to use it to expose them." "Yes. And what do I receive in return?" "Your father's name was restored," he said, "your estate returned, and your life which, as of last night, is considerably less certain than it was a week ago." He held her gaze. "I am not offering charity, Lady Hawthorne. I am proposing an alliance. You have information I cannot get alone. I have resources and protection you cannot manage without. This is practical." She considered him. "I don't trust you," she said plainly. "Good," he said. "I would find it alarming if you did, at this stage." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "Trust is earned. I am suggesting we begin earning it." She should have said no. She should have asked to be returned to London, retrieved her few belongings from Piccadilly, and found some other path forward entirely. But she thought about Thornfield's voice in that corridor, quiet and certain, the voice of a man who had already decided. And she thought about her father's handwriting in the journal, careful and deliberate, leaving breadcrumbs for exactly this moment. "All right," she said. "We begin. But I need to go back to London. There is something I didn't bring with me." Sebastian's eyes sharpened. "The secondary documents?" "Not the documents. But I think I know where my father left them." She looked at him evenly. "My father had a friend, a woman who used to come to our house when I was small. He trusted her with things he didn't trust to anyone else. She still lives in London." She paused. "Her name is Lady Cecilia Fairfax." Sebastian went very still. Something passed across his face so briefly she almost missed it. Recognition. And beneath it, something else. Something that looked, for just a moment, like dread. They left for London the following morning. Sebastian had spent the evening before at his writing desk. Amelia had seen the light under the study door when she had come downstairs for water past. Midnight, and he had emerged at breakfast, looking exactly as composed as he always did, which she was beginning to suspect required rather more effort than it appeared. He did not explain his reaction to Lady Cecilia Fairfax's name. She did not ask. There were too many other pressing questions, and she had learned quickly that Sebastian Blackwood answered questions in exactly the order he chose and pressing him only made him slower. The carriage ride back to London was mostly silent, which suited them both. Amelia watched the countryside give way to the city, with the particular feeling of someone returning to a battlefield they had briefly, and thankfully, left. London was bright and busy in the morning light, entirely indifferent, as cities are, to the private dramas occurring within them. The attack came before they reached Mayfair. It was not dramatic in the way stories sometimes make these things dramatic. There was no warning, no villain stepping forward to announce himself. The other carriage simply appeared from a side street, moving too fast and at the wrong angle, and drove hard into their left side. The impact threw Amelia sideways. She grabbed the door handle and Sebastian's arm simultaneously. His hand closed around her wrist with a speed and strength that startled her, and the carriage lurched, scraped against a post, and came to a violent, tilting stop. Sebastian was out the door before it had fully settled. She heard shouting outside, then a sharp crack she recognized with cold clarity as a gunshot. Then silence. Then Sebastian's voice, close to the door. Stay inside, firm, unhurried, like a man giving a mild instruction about the weather. She did not stay inside. She climbed out the other side, keeping low, and saw one man face down on the cobblestones, being held there by Sebastian's driver and a second man she didn't recognize. Another man was already gone running, presumably. Sebastian stood in the middle of the street, with his coat slightly disturbed and a pistol in his hand, watching the retreating figure with an expression of focused calm. He turned when he heard her behind him. "I told you to stay inside." "I heard a gunshot," she said. "A warning shot from my driver," he said, "to stop them moving, not aimed at anyone." He looked her over briefly, checking for injury with an efficiency that was thorough without being intrusive. "You are not hurt." "I am not." She looked at the man pinned to the ground. He was younger than she expected, a hired man, not a gentleman. Someone's instrument, not a principal. They knew we were coming back to London. "Yes," Sebastian said, "which means they have someone watching your estate." "Or watching the roads," he said. "Thornfield has connections I have not yet fully mapped." He slid the pistol away with the ease of a man for whom it was an ordinary tool. "We will use a different route and a different carriage." He glanced at her. "You are remarkably calm, Lady Hawthorne." "I am not calm," she said. "I am simply choosing not to be useful to them by falling apart in the middle of a London street." He looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary. "Come," he said. They reached Piccadilly on foot, taking routes that Sebastian seemed to know with the familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time moving through this city without wanting to be seen. At her building, she went upstairs alone while he waited below. She retrieved what she needed from her room, a small locked box that had belonged to her father, and a letter she had found inside the journal that she had not yet shown Sebastian. She was not ready to show it to him yet. She was ready by the time she returned. Almost. Lady Cecilia Fairfax lived in a handsome townhouse near Grosvenor Square. She was perhaps 60, elegant in the way of women who had learned long ago that elegance was a form of armor, with bright grey eyes, and the particular composure of someone who has seen a great deal of the world, and chosen which parts of it to be surprised by. She opened the door herself. When she saw Amelia, her face changed in a way that was hard to describe relief and sorrow, arriving at the same moment. When she saw Sebastian behind Amelia, her expression changed again. This time it was more complex. "Your Grace," she said, with a formality that did not quite cover the emotion beneath it. "Lady Fairfax," he said. Equally formal, equally something else. Amelia looked between them. "You know each other," she said. "We do," Lady Fairfax said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in, both of you." We have a great deal to discuss, and it has waited quite long enough. In Lady Fairfax's small, warm sitting room, with the curtains drawn, and a pot of tea sitting between them like a gentle pretense of an ordinary afternoon, the older woman explained what she had held on to for 2 years. Lord Edmund Hawthorne had visited her 6 days before his death. He had been frightened, not visibly so to anyone who didn't know him well, but she had known him well. He had given her a sealed envelope and made her swear on the friendship of 30 years to hold it until either he came back for it or, if he did not, until Amelia came to claim it. He said you would come when you were ready, Lady Fairfax told Amelia. He said not to seek you out, that you needed to find it yourself, or not at all. That the coming to find, it was part of the proof of what you were capable of. Her voice was steady and quietly proud. She produced the envelope from behind a false panel in the bookcase beside the fireplace. It was heavier than it looked. Amelia's name was written on the front in her father's handwriting. She did not open it immediately. She held it and breathed, and was, for a moment, simply his daughter, missing him with a force that was straightforward and complete. Then she opened it. Inside were 3 things: a signed and witnessed legal document establishing her as the sole legitimate heir to the Hawthorne estate and all its accounts, including those that had been falsely recorded as dissolved. A second document, in her father's handwriting, listed the full mechanism of the conspiracy, with dates, transactions, and signatures he had collected from sources she had never heard of, and a third, shorter letter addressed to her personally. She read the letter silently. The room was very quiet. When she looked up, her eyes were dry and her jaw was set, and she looked, Sebastian thought, watching from across the room like someone who had just picked up a weight she had been preparing to carry for a long time and found it exactly as heavy as expected. "He says there is one more thing," she said. "A person, someone inside their circle who was willing to testify, who had given my father a sworn affidavit in exchange for a promise of protection." She looked at the letter again. "He says the person's name is held by a solicitor in Clerkenwell, a man named Hartley." Sebastian stood up. "I know Hartley." "Of course you do," Amelia said, with something that was not quite dry and not quite warm, but occupied the space between. He almost smiled. Lady Fairfax refilled the teacups, because it was something useful to do. Hartley's office in Clerkenwell was small, cluttered, and smelled of old paper and candle wax, the smell of a man who worked long hours and relied on the past to explain the present. Mr. Hartley himself was perhaps 70, with the look of a man who had seen rather more of human nature than he had wanted to, and had arrived at a general peace with his findings. He received Sebastian and Amelia without apparent surprise, offered them the 2 chairs that were not occupied by stacked files, and listened to what they said with the patient attention of a man who has been waiting for a particular conversation and is glad it has finally arrived. "I was wondering," he said, when Amelia had finished, "whether you would find your way here before or after they found you." He looked at her over his spectacles. "Your father was a careful man. He said you would be careful too when the time came." "He gave you instructions," Amelia said. "He gave me a name," Hartley said, "a sealed affidavit, witnessed and signed, from someone inside Lord Thornfield's confidence, someone who grew uncomfortable with what was being done and made the choice, at some personal risk, to document it." "Who?" Sebastian said. Hartley reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and produced a sealed document. He held it for a moment before setting it on the desk between them. "Lady Vivian Ashcroft," he said. The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Amelia knew the name. Lady Vivian Ashcroft, blonde, exquisite, one of the most celebrated women in London society, beloved at every gathering, impeccably connected. She was, by common understanding, Thornfield's closest social ally, his companion at events, his apparent friend, his most public supporter. She testified against him? Amelia said carefully. She did, Hartley said. She was not involved in the financial crimes directly, but she witnessed certain conversations and was present at several meetings where explicit instructions were given. He paused. She was also, I believe, quite fond of Lord Hawthorne, in the way that people who have known genuine decency sometimes recognize it when they encounter it. She did not want him harmed. She was overruled. Amelia sat quietly with that for a moment. The danger, Sebastian said, taking the sealed document carefully, is that Thornfield likely suspects Lady Ashcroft's loyalty is not absolute. If he discovers she provided this, she is at risk, Amelia finished. We need to move quickly, Sebastian said. They spent the next several days at Blackwood Hall, which had begun to feel, in ways that Amelia found both comforting and alarming, like somewhere she belonged. Sebastian's study became their working room. Maps of London and lists of names covered the large central table. Documents were arranged and cross-referenced. Sebastian's man of business came and went. A trusted barrister arrived one afternoon and spent 3 hours with them, reviewing the legal implications of what they had assembled. Amelia worked. She was good at this, at the careful, sustained attention required to find the thread that connected things, to notice the detail that mattered. Sebastian saw this and adapted accordingly, giving her space to lead on the documentary analysis, while he managed the logistics and the legal framework. They fell into a rhythm. It was late on the 4th evening when she looked up from the table and found him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not measuring, not analytical, something quieter than either of those things. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. Then, "You haven't eaten since this morning. Neither have you. I'm aware." He stood, moved to the side table where the housekeeper had left a covered tray, and brought it to the desk without ceremony. He set it between their papers and sat back down and resumed reading. No fuss, no performance, just the quiet consideration of someone who had noticed without needing to announce it. She ate and pretended not to notice that she was smiling. The 5th day brought bad news. One of Sebastian's contacts in the city sent word that Thornfield had moved. He had discovered Lady Fairfax's connection to Amelia, not the envelope, apparently, but the connection itself. Lady Fairfax had been visited that morning by 2 men asking questions. She had maintained her composure admirably, told them nothing, and had since been escorted discreetly to her niece's house in Bath by one of Sebastian's men. But the visit confirmed it. Thornfield was closing the net. "They know I'm not in London," Amelia said. "They know you're somewhere with me," Sebastian said, which was something slightly different. "My reputation is both a disadvantage and an advantage here. They will be cautious about moving directly against me. But they will look for another angle." The other angle arrived that same evening. A letter came for Sebastian, hand-delivered, no return address. It was from Lady Vivian Ashcroft. She wrote that she had been contacted by Thornfield, who had asked, in the pointed way of a man who was asking and threatening simultaneously, whether she knew where the Duke of Blackwood was, and whether she was aware of any recent contact between Sebastian and a young woman named Hawthorne. She had said no to both, but she needed to meet with them urgently, tonight, if possible. There was something she had not told Hartley, something she had been afraid to write down, and she believed it changed the shape of everything. Sebastian read the letter once, then handed it to Amelia. "We go," she said, before he could say it. "I expected you to argue," he said. "There's nothing to argue. She helped my father, and she may know something that saves us." She folded the letter, Besides, you'd go whether I agreed or not. A pause. That's true, he said. Then let's not waste time pretending otherwise. She picked up her cloak from the chair. Which carriage? Not the usual one, I assume. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in the look that was not professional and not distant. It was direct and unguarded, and lasted perhaps 2 seconds before he turned away. The black one, he said. We leave in 10 minutes. Lady Vivian Ashcroft received them in the back parlour of a friend's house in Belgravia, moving through the city's social geography with the ease of a woman who had spent her life navigating it. She was, in person, not what Amelia had expected. She had imagined someone cool, calculating. The kind of beauty that keeps people at a distance, but the woman who sat across from her was simply frightened very elegantly, very quietly frightened, in the way that composed people are frightened when they have run out of the composure that composure requires. I have carried this for 2 years, Lady Ashcroft said, without preamble. I want it understood that I did not know what he intended when I agreed to be present at those meetings, and when I understood when I saw what was happening, I went to your father, Lady Hawthorne. Not because I was brave, because I could not sleep. Amelia said nothing. She simply listened. There is something beyond what I gave Mr. Hartley, Lady Ashcroft said. She reached into the small bag on her lap and produced a folded paper. 3 weeks before your father died, I witnessed a conversation I was not supposed to witness. I was in the library at Pemberton's house. I had gone to return a book. The door was partly open. Lord Thornfield was speaking to Lord Haverley and one other man. They were discussing the timeline for the next phase of the property transfers, and your father's name came up. She stopped. She put the paper on the table between them. They weren't discussing ruining him financially. They were discussing removing him entirely. And the third man, the one who agreed to arrange it, was someone your father considered a close friend. Someone who was at your house regularly when you were a child. Amelia looked at the paper. Lord Thomas Whitmore. She had known him since she was 8 years old. He had attended her father's birthday gatherings. He had sent her a kind note when the estate was lost. He had expressed, at the time, deep personal sorrow at Edmund Hawthorne's death. She sat with the information for a long, quiet moment. Thank you for telling me, she said at last, and her voice was steady. Lady Ashcroft exhaled slowly. I am sorry I waited so long. You're here now, Amelia said. That matters. They were followed, leaving the house. Not, obviously, this was not an ambush, but surveillance. The careful attention of people who wanted to know where they were going rather than stop them immediately. Sebastian noticed it first and altered their route without announcement, taking a series of turns through the quieter streets of Belgravia that eventually lost the tail, without drawing attention to the fact that they knew about it. We're running out of time, Amelia said, once they were clear. We have what we need, Sebastian said. The documents from your father, the affidavit from Lady Ashcroft. Hartley's witnessed records. We have enough. Enough for what? For a solicitor's office. For a quiet legal proceeding that disappears into the machinery before anything changes. She shook her head. They have influence everywhere, Sebastian. The only way this works is if it cannot be made quiet. It has to be public. He looked at her. The parliamentary gathering, she said. The grand session is next Thursday. Every significant peer and nobleman in the country is in one room. That's where it has to happen, in front of all of them. In front of people they cannot bribe or silence quickly enough. Silence in the carriage. If we go there and they are ready for us, he said carefully, it becomes dangerous very quickly. If we don't go there, she said, they keep winning, and they will eventually find me with or without protection. She met his eyes. I have been running my whole life. I am done running. He was quiet for a long time. The city moved past the carriage windows. "Then we go," he said. But we got prepared. The days before the parliamentary gathering were the most intense of Amelia's life. She barely slept. She worked through the documents with the barrister until the legal case was as watertight as they could make it. She rehearsed, in her own mind, the exact order in which the evidence needed to be presented. What had to be said first to establish credibility, what had to follow to remove any possible defense. Sebastian, meanwhile, made quiet arrangements she was not entirely privy to. Men came and went from Blackwood Hall at odd hours. Letters were sent and received. He had contacts in places she hadn't expected, doing things she asked about once and then chose to trust. On the evening before the gathering, they sat again in the study, the table finally cleared of most of its papers, the fire low. "When this is over," he said, without looking up from the document he was reading, "you will have your estate returned, your name, your inheritance. When this is over," she said, "you will have proved what happened to your father." He did look up then. And the thing that was in his face was not the composed, measured expression she had come to read as his default. It was something older and less managed. "Yes," he said simply. She set down her pen. "Sebastian, what will you do after?" He seemed to consider the question with genuine attention, as though the after was something he had not permitted himself to think about until this moment. "I'm not certain," he said. "I have spent so long preparing for the fight that the other side of it is not quite real to me yet." A pause. "And you?" She had thought about it. She had thought about returning to Wiltshire, to the estate, to a life that was hers again. She had thought about what it would feel like to walk through her father's house, knowing his name was restored. She had thought about all of it. She had also thought in the quieter moments, the ones she hadn't planned, about this room, and this table, and the man across from her, who had never once suggested she should be somewhere else. "I'll figure it out," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said softly, "I believe you will." The parliamentary gathering was held in one of the great halls of Westminster, a high, silinged, chandelier-lit space designed to make human beings feel appropriately small in the presence of the institutions they served. The kingdom's most powerful men filled it in their finest clothes, conducting the formal business of England with the particular mixture of ceremony and self-importance that such occasions require. Amelia arrived in a carriage that was not Sebastian's. She wore blue, not the same gown from the night she had run, but one she had chosen with deliberate intention. The same color, the color that her father had always said suited her best. She wore her hair the way she always wore it to formal occasions, and she carried her father's documents inside a dark leather folio bearing the Hawthorne crest that had not been used for 2 years. She was, to anyone watching, simply a young woman arriving at an event. To the 2 men positioned near the main entrance, who were clearly not there for the parliamentary business, she was something else entirely. She saw them. She kept walking. Sebastian was already inside. She had not seen him since that morning, when he had told her the arrangements were in place, and that she should trust the timing. He had said it with the quiet certainty she had come to recognize as his way of asking her to believe in him without demanding it. She had told him she trusted the plan. She had mostly meant it. The formal business began. Amelia took her position near the gallery where women were present as observers, which suited her precisely, and watched Lord Thornfield below, seated among his peers with the easy authority of a man who believes the day belongs to him. He had not seen her yet. She had 40 minutes before the point in the agenda she had identified with the barrister. 40 minutes to wait and breathe and remind herself that she had done this correctly, that the documents were real, that the affidavit was signed, that the law in the end did not particularly care how confident Lord Thornfield felt in his seat. Haverley saw her first. She watched him spot her from across the room and watched his face change in the way that faces change when something expected has arrived too soon. He leaned toward Thornfield and said something. Thornfield's eyes moved to the gallery. They looked at each other. She did not look away. At that moment, something she had not expected happened. Not afraid, she had expected fear and prepared for it. But something simpler, something that felt, oddly, like relief. Like setting down something heavy after a very long walk. She thought of her father's handwriting in the letter Lady Fairfax had kept for her. She thought of the last line of it, the one she had read 3 times in the quiet of Blackwood Hall, before folding it and putting it away. He had written, "Do not let them make you small. You were never small. I only hope I gave you enough time to discover it yourself," she had. When the moment came, she walked down from the gallery to the floor. The room did not immediately notice, and then, slowly, it did. A woman, walking to the center of a parliamentary gathering, carrying a folio. The murmur began at the edges of the room and moved inward. Lord Thornfield rose to his feet. "This is highly irregular." "Yes," Amelia said clearly. Her voice carried in the high-ceilinged room better than she had expected. "So is murdering a peer of the realm and stealing his estate. I believe we can agree that this is an irregular situation generally." The room went completely still. She opened the folio. She spoke for 12 minutes. She had rehearsed it precisely, knowing that in a room full of men accustomed to dismissing women, precision was her only luxury. She stated the facts in order. She presented the documentation systematically. She named the names Thornfield, Haverley, Pemberton, Whitmore, with the steady calm of someone who is not performing outrage, but delivering evidence. When she had finished the primary presentation, she said, "I am also in possession of a sworn affidavit from a witness to direct conversations in which Lord Thornfield explicitly ordered the removal of my father. I have legal documentation establishing my inheritance rights under existing estate law. And I have records of the financial mechanism used across 14 separate aristocratic families over a period of 11 years, signed and witnessed by a solicitor of this city who is available to testify." Thornfield began to speak. 2 of his associates began to stand. The room began to fracture into noise, and then Sebastian stood. He was at the far side of the floor, and the room turned toward him with the automatic attention that his presence always generated. He was carrying a second folio, and he laid it open on the nearest table with deliberate unhurry. "I add to Lady Hawthorne's evidence," he said, in the voice that had never once required volume to be heard, "my own documentation, collected over 18 months, which corroborates and extends the case she has presented, including records pertaining to the death of the late Duke of Blackwood, which was ruled a medical event and was not." He looked directly at Thornfield. "I declare myself publicly as Lady Hawthorne's advocate in this matter, and invite the presiding officials of this body to immediately convene the appropriate review." The room erupted. Thornfield's composure cracked not dramatically, but in the specific, visible way that composure cracks when a man who has controlled everything for a long time loses control of the room. He turned. He looked at his allies. He found them suddenly very interested in the floor. Haverley sat back down. Pemberton's solicitor, who had been positioned near the door, left the building. Lord Whitmore, who had been near the back of the room, arriving late as Amelia had hoped he would, was met at the exit by 2 officers of the Crown who had been positioned there by prior arrangement. Sebastian's prior arrangement. That had been the part she had trusted him on. He had not let her down. It did not end in one afternoon. These things never do. There were weeks of formal proceedings, reviews, commissions appointed, documents verified, lawyers on every side, arguing through every available channel. There were mornings that were exhausting, and evenings that were tense, and days in between that felt suspended, waiting for the next turn. But the machinery had been set in motion, and it could not now be stopped. Lord Thornfield was arrested 38 days after the parliamentary gathering, on charges that took 2 pages to list. Lord Haverley resigned his parliamentary position and was subsequently charged. Lord Pemberton's solicitor, in exchange for reduced charges, provided records that confirmed everything. Lord Whitmore, faced with the affidavit and the weight of the rest of the evidence, did not contest the case. Lady Vivian Ashcroft testified, briefly and precisely and without drama, in a voice that did not waver. When it was over, she was quietly fierce with something that looked like relief. Lady Fairfax, reached by post in Bath, sent Amelia a letter that contained only 4 words. Your father would approve. The Hawthorne estate in Wiltshire was formally returned. Lord Edmund Hawthorne's name was restored to formal recognition, entered into the public record that the proceedings against his estate had been unlawful and fraudulent, and that his financial record and personal character were unblemished. Amelia stood in the study of Hawthorne House, dusty from disuse, cold, smelling of absence, and put her hand on her father's old desk and was quiet for a long time. Then she opened the windows. Sebastian came a week later. He had not imposed it. She had asked for the week, not explicitly, but in the way things are understood, between people who have spent a great deal of time reading each other carefully, and he had given it. He arrived on a clear autumn morning in the black carriage, and found her in the garden, not doing anything in particular, simply standing in it, looking at the landscape her father had loved. He stood beside her. They were quiet for a while, in the way that comfortable quiet only becomes possible between people who have been through something real together. How does it feel? He asked. Larger than I expected, she said, and quieter. She looked at the old orchard at the far edge of the grounds. I thought it would feel like victory. Mostly it feels like the beginning of something. It usually does, he said. She turned to look at him. He was watching the orchard too, and the morning light was on his face. And he looked, she thought, less like someone carrying something heavy. Not unburdened, probably not that, not yet, not for a man who had spent years living inside this pursuit, but lighter. Sebastian, she said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Not diplomatically. Honestly. Always, he said. Did you keep me at Blackwood Hall because it was practical? Because you needed what I knew, and I needed your protection, and it was simply an efficient arrangement. She held his gaze. Or was there another reason? He was quiet long enough that she thought he was choosing between the diplomatic answer and the honest one. Then he looked at her, fully, without the careful management she had come to understand as his armor. Both, he said, at first, and then not both. Just another reason, she breathed. You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a very long time, he said, and I am a man who has encountered a considerable number of people. Most of them I observe. You I watch. There is a difference. He paused. I did not intend for it to happen. I am not certain it was avoidable. It was not avoidable, she said. Something moved across his face, something open, unguarded, that she suspected very few people had ever seen. No, he agreed. I didn't think so. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. They stood in the garden as the morning moved over the estate, and the old orchard rustled at the far edge of the grounds, and the house behind them, her house, her name, her life returned, breathed quietly in the autumn light. It was not perfect. It would not be simple. There was a great deal of restoration ahead of the estate, of her finances, of the ordinary fabric of a life that had been disrupted for 2 years. And between them, there was still so much to be learned in the patient, layered way that two careful people learn each other. Slowly, honestly, without shortcuts. But she was not running, and that, she thought, was the beginning of everything. What this story teaches us. There is a lesson in Amelia Hawthorne's story that does not belong only to the Victorian era, or to English nobility, or to the particular world of grand estates and parliamentary intrigue. It belongs to anyone who has ever been told by circumstance, by loss, by the cruelty of people in power that they are smaller than they are. Amelia was not remarkable because she was fearless. She was remarkable because she was afraid, and she went forward anyway. Fear is not the absence of courage. It is the presence of something worth caring about. She cared about the truth. She cared about her father's name. She cared about the kind of world in which people who are wronged have some recourse, not only people with power, but people willing to go and build what power they need from what they have been given. What she had been given was a journal, a locked box, 2 years of careful listening, and a mind that had never stopped looking for the thread that connected things. It was enough. Sebastian Blackwood teaches us something equally important. He appeared to be a villain because powerful, private men who act outside visible channels are easy to fear and easy to misread. His reputation as cold, ruthless, and dangerous was built by the very people he was working against. Because the most effective way to neutralize someone is to convince everyone around them that they cannot be trusted. He had lived inside that mischaracterization for years because the work mattered more to him than the perception. There are people in our own lives whose surfaces do not match their depths. That is worth remembering. And between Amelia and Sebastian, love did not make them weaker. Love, in this story, is what happens when two people who are already strong choose, with full knowledge of each other's complications, to stand in the same direction. That is not a romantic fairy tale. That is the best version of what love actually is. Run toward the truth, even when you are afraid of what you will find. Keep the records. Write things down. Leave breadcrumbs for the people who come after you, and when someone shows you, quietly and without theater, that they are on your side, pay attention. Some carriages are not mistakes. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.